Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 34. Our opportunities to follow the events of the ever-widening war and political changes around the globe were excellent, if one used them. Of course, German government reports could not officially be obtained. The forwarding of German newspapers and the like was prohibited. The only thing left was to listen in illegally on shortwave transmission from the Reich. To receive them, soon after the opening of the camp, skillful hands had conjured up a radio set built from next to nothing and concealed in the hollow leg of a table the prisoners had made. The electricity for it was taken from the Canadian system by means of a converter. Replacement tubes were obtained as needed by mobilizing the kindness of our Canadian guards by plausible pretexts and with the help of little gifts. This information gathering was extremely delicate. The radio was also capable of transmitting, and every such contact with the outside world was a dangerous undertaking for prisoners of war. One must never be caught off guard. Keeping the radio secret was of utmost importance, and the daily tuning in was done only with the strictest security against unwelcome surprises, with lookouts at the door. The news received served as the camp's quasi-official newscast, which was read out after the noon meal. But whoever wished to inform himself beyond this something for everybody information that mirrored the officialese of the Reich could do this too. On the outside of the living quarters hung loudspeakers from which one could listen to public radio programs, news and entertainment to which the Canadian camp administration tuned in. It was possible to take subscriptions to Allied newspapers and magazines, which were easily paid for from our monthly allowances. Of course, some prisoners could not stand such media. All purely enemy propaganda. We don't want it. They rejected information from Allied sources a limine. Others subscribed, however. I took the conservative Toronto daily paper, The Globe and Mail, the British weekly Daily Mail Overseas, the US business magazine Fortune, and later, in place of the latter, the British political monthly magazine, The 19th Century and After. The Globe and Mail also regularly carried syndicated columns by two of the most important American journalists, the great international commentator Walter Lippmann and that German expert and humanist, the unforgettable Dorothy Thompson. With the help of these publications, I felt that I was broadly and for the most part accurately informed about the course of the war and world politics. Of course, as a subject of conversation in camp, world politics and as a congruent to the subject of Hitler, politics in general were for me as good as taboo. The monstrous spectacle of the dictatorship in the Reich and the hopelessness of helping the victims who had become addicted to the propaganda of the Brown State to gain reasonable national perspective had long since closed my mouth. On Hitler, there was a parting of minds. Opposing attitudes towards him lacked any common ground. For our camp community was fundamentally nothing else than a miniature German community of the folk, as though viewed through a reducing lens with a power of 500. Its center was formed by the overwhelming majority of Hitler-believing fellow travelers. On the opposing ends of the spectrum were the representatives of more pronounced viewpoints. On one side, the extreme fanatical Nazis, the so-called 150%ers, and on the other, insignificant in numbers, the confirmed opponents of the regime. And did it make sense to heat up raw emotions in conversations with those who thought differently, without the release of purposeful activity, indeed without any possibility of it, behind barbed wire in the middle of a war? Very dangerous. The consequences could not be controlled. Politically motivated murder and manslaughter had already occurred in other camps. Better then to keep one's mouth shut and to work. On a still very distant day, one would again be free to say what one wished. Hitler could not hold the Germans in chains forever. To be sure, he might have nothing to fear from inside, but now the military might of almost the entire world was threatening him. He himself had set it in motion against him. He was his own worst enemy. Of course, to keep my mouth closed under any and every circumstance, uninterruptedly so to say, was more than I could manage. The most violent agitation gripped me whenever I read a report in the Allied press, often half hidden by way of suggestion and unconfirmed conjecture of killings and atrocities behind the German battlefronts. Before the background of the racial madness loose in Germany, with the crackling Kurfürstendamm of November the 9th of 1938 always in mind, such press notices sprang to horrifying reality. Who are we, that we set ourselves up as judges over other people, that we feel called upon to decide on the worth and worthlessness of foreign life, to legitimize our elimination of inferior beings? I spit out the words, as it were, on one of my walks with one of the 2 or 3 officers in camp to whom I could say such things at all. The German reputation, our right to self-respect, they will be lost for an eternity. We are pulling ourselves down for every single day of the Hitler regime. It will take a year to rehabilitate Germany among the community of nations, and even that may not suffice. The outlook is becoming worse and worse. My uncontradicted monologue had relieved me somewhat. I couldn't expect that it would do more. Then again, the day came when abruptly and for no apparent reason the blinders fell. "We are basically still not a nation at all," I announced to one of my trusted friends. "For what was jammed together and tied up with so much pressure and force from above can hardly have grown into it organically. After 1,000 years of German history, still not grown into it, still no true nation." At that time, in the 10th year of the Hitler regime, I found this a disturbing realization. One other time, also, I was unable to contain myself. On the morning of July the 21st of 1944, the day after the unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Hitler. In the camp street, otherwise empty at that early hour, I met, of us inmates, the officer with whom I could talk more openly than with any other. "Damn," we called to one another. "It didn't work." And immediately after, again almost simultaneously, "Have we gone crazy to shout that out here? Let's clear out." The first excitement and the chill despair that fate had again so cruelly decided against Germany had swept over us. Yet, out of the initial surge of emotion, I could not form a lasting view of the consequences of the failure. In the end, it was necessary to distinguish and inwardly to choose between two evils. Either Hitler lived, as had happened, and only our adversary's victory would bring the frightful killing and destruction to an end, or, to enter into speculation, suppose the attempt had succeeded. Then, in my opinion, with the stab in the back legend following the First World War, my own initial gullibility in the face of it, and the striking susceptibility of my countrymen to political legends always in mind, another consequence would have become inevitable. The new legend would have freed Hitler from responsibility for the defeat and fastened it on the assassins, the traitors. The prospect of the devastation of Germany to be expected from the living Hitler had to be weighed against, in the other case, the politically ruinous way of thought to be feared among subsequent generations who believed the legend. Each person may assess these alternatives, now historical, for himself. The news of Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg's assassination attempt reached us through the secret radio stations the day that it occurred and shook the camp like an earthquake. Everyone was speedily informed of the events in the Wolf's Lair. Uneasiness and the paralysis of all emotion were the first reaction. The events in the Reich were spoken of only in whispers and undertones. Soon, we also learned of the execution of Stauffenberg and others at the Bendlerstraße and, to me the most tormenting, the appointment of Himmler as Commander-in-Chief of the Home Army. Then the possibility that the conspirators had sympathizers in Bowmanville arose, was dragged forward and brooded about. Suspicion of certain individuals spread throughout the camp. The waves of excitement grew ever higher, if and the extent to which they would die down appeared increasingly questionable. During those days, National Socialist fanatics in another officer's camp shouted, "String up the Catholics and the nobility!" And some people in Bowmanville may not have viewed matters very differently. The senior officer in camp acted at once. Generalleutnant Arthur Schmidt, a veteran of the Deutsches Afrika Korps and above all suspicion as a supporter of Hitler and suitably certified by his annual address on November the 9th, the anniversary of Hitler's unsuccessful Munich putsch in 1923, assembled us at a muster on the evening of July the 21st. He damned the conspirators and called us to close ranks behind Hitler. And in fact, camp life returned to normal. At least outwardly it did, but emotional residues and potentially explosive attitudes remained in existence. It was on August the 14th, 1944 that one of our officers, a Luftwaffe captain whom we will call X, went over to the Canadians. He had taken advantage of a stay outside the compound not to return and placed himself at the disposition of the custodial power. A wild wave of excitement gripped the camp. Attitudes still heated from the attempt on Hitler reached the boiling point. For days, the air seemed to lie on us all heavy as lead, thick enough to cut, unwilling to lift, suffocating. A self-appointed drumhead court-martial condemned X in absentia to death on account of desertion and declared him an outlaw. Any occupant of the camp who encountered him anywhere would be entitled to kill him. "Absolute nonsense," Seeborg growled to me at a favorable occasion. "No one here has jurisdiction." The extreme Nazis in the camp then raised additional questions. Who will desert next? Who knew of X's plan? With whom was X most often seen together? And what kind of people are they, inside and out? they found that Schmidt had not conducted the previous investigation aggressively enough and wanted to investigate for themselves. Camp discipline fell into the shadows. Advocates of vigilante action were undermining the primacy of the military hierarchy, but before things got dangerously out of hand, Schmidt did the only correct thing and undercut the competition by undertaking the interrogations and making the decisions himself. For my part, I now expected to be questioned by Schmidt at any moment, as in the past months I had occasionally talked with X on walks. In the complete rejection of the so-called National Socialism, I had found myself at one with him, although our motives were very different. But our exchange of thoughts always remained purely academic. Through no syllable, no sign, could I have become aware of his intention to desert. Besides, he must have regarded the creation of initiates as a danger to his secret plan. My fundamental attitude to such changes of sides had long been clear. To have emigrated on political grounds before the war in the conviction that one would be unable to lessen the national catastrophe under Hitler and, to the contrary, would personally have to collaborate with it, that I can understand. But to desert in 1944 during the war? No, never. You know the monstrous thing which has taken place, Müllenheim, and I have to get to the bottom of your possible complicity in the desertion of Captain X, Schmidt told me when he summoned me on August 17th. As you were repeatedly seen together with X, the possibility cannot be dismissed that you had been initiated into his plans and improperly kept silent. He continued, You also know that, in violation of military conventions, I have been attacked by some hyperactive officers as supposedly too indecisive in the investigation of Captain X. I am personally conducting this investigation and according to the standards that duty dictates. I will announce the results at a camp assembly, at which I will also give my opinion of the gentlemen who have personally pressed me too closely. What do you have to say? It is quite true, Herr General, I replied, that I have spoken with Captain X on occasion, but I never heard anything about his intentions to desert or even any such ideas. I myself most definitely condemn his step and have absolutely nothing to do with it. Of this I assure you, and there's nothing more that I can say. I will take this under serious consideration, Schmidt said, but Müllenheim, there is something more. Your continually critical remarks about our government are known, and indeed have been for a long time, and because of the present atmosphere in the camp alone, I do not see how I can avoid publicly naming your name. This was a damnably unwelcome revelation, and I had to reflect before replying. Certainly, as I've said before, over the years I had been reserved in political conversations or avoided them altogether. But one could scarcely conceal his inner self completely for long in such a crowded communal society. Gestures and the unspoken word counted in it. Hadn't just recently an officer newly assigned to the camp told me of his first question to a friend he encountered there? With whom can one speak openly in this cloud cuckoo land? And hadn't the latter answered, with Korvettenkapitän von Müllenheim of the Bismarck. And soon thereafter, hadn't we had a conversation that he characterized as an oasis in the desert? Hadn't I long been too many the objective one, the citizen of the world? To attempt to deny my critical remarks about our government to Schmidt would therefore have been more than merely tactically a false move. Herr General, I finally formulated it, your announcement is not agreeable to me, and I would much prefer it if you left me unmentioned. With the case that is the only thing being debated here, I have nothing to do, absolutely nothing at all. Schmidt seemed to hesitate. I will see, and you will hear further, he said before the door closed behind me. Then he continued his investigation, sounding out people about me and interrogating others. When he summoned me again on August 24th, he had dropped the point of my complicity in the desertion, but not my criticism of our government. Apparently, he was under enormous pressure from the camp extremists. Yet, I could only repeat my previous statements. He once again withheld his final decision, and more days had to pass in agonizing suspense before the morning of August 28th, the day of the assembly, when I once more stood before the general. No, Müllenheim, Schmidt told me. I'm sorry, but I can't leave you out of my address this evening. I have made inquiries, very many, very precise inquiries, and you appear too heavily compromised by your critical remarks. But at first, and for the most part, I will settle accounts with those gentlemen who have laid their hands on military discipline and have seriously wronged and insulted me. Your turn will come later. If you believe that you must act in this manner, Herr General, I must understand. Besides, I can't stop you, I replied, and my last interview was over. Schmidt acted on his words. After condemning the deserter and justifying the verdict of the drumhead court-martial, he devoted the main portion of his 80-minute-long address to reprimanding the officers who, although in an ever-so-well-meant excess of zeal, had forgotten military conventions. He did not come to me, politically the other extreme so to speak, until the very end and then very briefly. He deplored my repeated criticisms and advised me to lay aside my uniform after the war and leave the armed forces. Curiously, the thought that came to mind was, the outcome of the war, Herr General, will be such that you may have to lay aside the uniform before I do. But I was in anything other than high spirits. A deep silence lay over the hall, and when at the end of the address I returned to my quarters like everyone else, with the usual camp stool tucked under my arm, it was as though I did so inside a glass jar of isolation. A new era of communal life might have begun for me. I would find out, but I certainly would not change my views of Hitler. Cheer up, it's been publicly certified that you've thought otherwise. These surprising words were as welcome as they were unexpected a greeting the next morning. Out on an early walk through the camp, I had encountered Generalleutnant Hans von Ravenstein, and it was he who had spoken to me in such a friendly way. I looked at him gratefully, but avoided involving him in a longer conversation in public, which, in view of the still ticklish mood in camp, could have unpleasant consequences for him. He was the last person I would have wished them on. Moreover, although much remained unsaid, to me we appeared to be completely in agreement. After the war, that was how I summed up his message to me, we would have a politically sanitary government without a brown residue. At the time, we certainly did not visualize a Globke Oberländer state, a state of conservative restoration and lacking political hygiene. Generalleutnant von Ravenstein, a Silesian from a military family dating from before the wars of Frederick the Great, slender, with the finely chiseled features of an aristocrat, even a little reminiscent of the Hohenzollerns, had come to our camp in 1943 after being captured while commanding the 21st Panzer Division in Libya. Soon after his arrival, he had proven himself to be a speaker who could figuratively tear his listeners out of their seats. His fiery words, his repeated "In Afrika wird gerommelt," seemed to have truly transferred the battlefield into the auditorium. If anyone was able to fire up soldiers, he was definitely the man. But to listen to him most carefully was absolutely necessary. For what he left unsaid was as important for an understanding of his evaluations and judgments as were his spoken words. Repeatedly decorated for bravery during the First World War and awarded the Ordre pour le Mérite as a captain in May of 1918 for an outstanding feat of arms, after the war he was for many years active in a high position in the communal service in the Ruhr. Becoming a soldier again in 1934 during the Second World War, he had fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, in Africa, receiving the Knight's Cross in June of 1940. His charming, charismatic personality and his innate diplomacy, refined amid the changing scenes of his life, would later make him in another place a camp leader who was equally well respected by the Germans and the Canadians. On August the 29th, the day after Schmidt's speech, there was a general sports day in camp. Everyone had to take part. It was not to be a championship competition since participation was all that mattered, a good thing. I refused to give in to a fleeting impulse born of the bitterness of the past days not to turn out. Nothing would have been more wrong-headed. I did all the required exercises, even if doing so was still a little like being under glass. It rapidly became clear that on the whole, Schmidt's words had purified the atmosphere and helped restore camp discipline to what it should be. How many hard feelings remained on an individual level after all the turbulence was something that would become evident eventually. And it did. Difficulties were placed against my continuing membership in the law class. A few in attendance wished to expel a politically unreliable. As the pressure continued to mount, I considered the situation from all angles and discussed it with a few friends. From the very beginning, Seeborg supported my inclination to continue, and the attitude of our dean was decisive. Give in to the pressure, I said to myself, only because I hold politically sound opinions? I won't think of it. On September the 5th, the beginning of our 6th semester, I appeared in the lecture hall as usual. In an atmosphere of icy rejection and, to counter it, of defiance, I took my customary place. The lecture began, many more lectures began, and time overtook the rest. I carted my difficulties away. Already we were not far distant from the dissolution of the Bowmanville camp and our transfer to another part of Canada. And otherwise? Some men with whom I had become personally close over the years showed themselves unwilling to be seen with me and sealed themselves off. Some friends became only friends. I must and could live with this. In the outside world, our defeat at Stalingrad and the collapse of our U-boat war already lay more than a year, and the Allied invasion of Normandy a few months in the past. In the Soviet Union, our armies appeared to be flowing back to the frontiers of the Reich almost without a halt. Whenever the decisive turning point of the war had actually occurred, for a long time now it had not taken a prophet, even behind barbed wire, to foresee our defeat. And for how long now I had gone to bed and gotten up with the vision of an apocalypse, the consummation of the German catastrophe that was taking place before our eyes, the mere military course of events, the quaking of the decaying Reich under the blows administered by the World Coalition, the desperate mobilization of imaginary reserves provided their own depressing commentary. The tension often drove me outdoors, for it became increasingly difficult to bear all this in silence. You too certainly see, I said at the end of 1944 to someone who could hold his tongue, that the moment for an attempt to save diplomatically whatever of Germany can be saved, to enter into negotiations, has long since passed. But the Führer will not negotiate. Besides, who would negotiate with him? The only thing that matters to him is the prolongation of his rule, a prolongation of days, hours. Whatever it costs in life and material values is immaterial to him. And if at the time of his exit nothing is left of Germany except ashes, he can't imagine anything finer. You remember his speech of November the 8th of 1943, just 7 months ago? My companion did not know of it. Well now, I continued, in his traditional speech on the anniversary of his putsch in the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich, he said something, I heard it over the radio or read it in the press at the time, that immediately caught my attention. He said, I would not be sorry if the German people go under, for in that case it would have deserved nothing better. He is living out his resolution now, I went on. The battlefronts tell it to you, yes, whoever surrenders himself to that charlatan doesn't need his own supply of cynicism. Degrading, insulting attacks by Hitler on his German listeners were nothing new, nor did they disturb me, but, to the contrary, increased the exultation of the masses. Thus, Hitler could make such pronouncements without risk to himself and apparently delighted in doing so. He said something similar, I learned of it later, however, to the Reichsleiter and Gauleiter at the Wolf's Lair in August of 1944, that if the German people should be defeated in this struggle, then it has been too weak, has failed its test before history, and would therefore be destined for nothing other than destruction. With only slightly different words, he had expressed himself to a foreigner as early as the setback outside Moscow in November of 1941, saying that he would shed no tears for the German people. True. In order to understand that Hitler thought this way, it is not at all necessary to know of such remarks. They were clearly evident in his policy. At the end of 1944, with the rubbing out of Germany that Hitler had so publicly accepted before our eyes, I now thought that even our enemies might have something more merciful in mind for us. But how did millions unflinchingly allow themselves to be led senselessly to the slaughterhouse by only a single individual? If I viewed the years 1933 to 1944 as a whole, they taught me something. State philosophers and historians long ago crystallized that something into historical experience. And I don't know who ever expressed it more clearly than the French parliamentarian and author Etienne La Boétie more than 400 years ago in his treatise On Voluntary Servitude. It says, "It is the people themselves who mistreat themselves to their tyrants. They are the helpless helpers of the thieves who rob them, and they encourage the murderer who kills them. They are traitors to their own cause." In 20th century Germany, nothing had changed. Others in the camp showed perplexity, naturally. One said, "We must become still more fanatical, more Japanese than the Japanese." He was thinking of the kamikazes and had a very fixed look in his eye. Another, "Well now, the retreat in Russia, to me it appears to be nothing more than the reaction to the action. Billiard balls roll back on rebounding. It certainly looks bad at the moment, but that's exactly why we have the Führer. I believe in him." Nothing could have been falser than the suggestion that even a billiard ball could roll back to its starting point. Everyone was permitted his sort of consolation. More camp life today, and as you have heard, things are getting more heated when it comes to the political situation in Germany as far as the inmates know. Even at this point in July of 1944, there were zealots who thought that the war must just be fought harder for it to be won. And when the conspirators of the July 20 plot tried to assassinate Hitler, these same zealots branded them traitors. Now, I'm sure you all know von Stauffenberg and you all have watched the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise. He is considered one of the most honorable officers there ever were, and every year there is a memorial service being held where he was shot on the same day he planted the bomb at the Wolf's Lair. Stauffenberg, that is, not Tom Cruise. His family home in Lautlingen in southern Germany is a museum and can be visited. I've been twice and can recommend everyone to go and pay the €2 fee to have a look inside. I will attach a picture that I've taken myself. Another interesting figure is General Johann Theodor von Ravenstein. Besides having an awesome name, he is quite a personality. Born in 1889, he came from a military family, and his great-grandfather actually fought at the Battle of Waterloo as adjutant to General Blücher. Ravenstein himself fought in both World Wars, received the Knight's Cross, and was taken prisoner by soldiers from the 2nd New Zealand Division near Tobruk. He was repatriated in 1947 and continued as a public servant in the city of Duisburg in the Ruhr Valley. In 1955, he was actually offered the position of Supreme General of the Armed Forces of Egypt by then King Farouk of Egypt, but he declined and chose the civilian life in post-war Germany. What a life. So, that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Cheers.